Good morning. We enjoyed the thunderstorm last night. When you're in a hotel room, you got these giant windows, and Caroline likes weather, all kinds of weather. And so until the lights went out, we were enjoying the weather. And even then, there was some enjoyment. I did learn the hotel, the lights all went out, but the internet still worked. So I'm not sure what that says about their priorities. I'm glad that y'all now have access to these. And let me move this over. I want to talk for a moment about some of the things, actually some of it came out of questions people had last night that I wanted to clarify some. And we talked about Romans 12:18, as far as is possible for you to be at peace with all men. There are going to be circumstances in life where you can't make peace on your own. And I was thinking of an example. I think the most common example right now in our culture is over the LGBTQ issue. And the temptation will be you have a family member, a child or a grandchild or a sister, and they invite you to their wedding to someone of the same gender. And not only that, they'll say, and if you don't come, you're dead to me, because you're toxic and you don't affirm my choices. And I think we can love our family members who are in sin. Their problem, as Rosaria Butterfield said, is not their sexuality. Their problem is they're lost. And she said, I wasn't converted out of lesbianism to being a heterosexual, now pastor's wife. She was converted from unbelief to belief, and she came to faith in Christ. And so that's what they need. But like my view would be, I can't call a woman a man, and I can't call something that would be a travesty a marriage. I'll give you one of my arguments about the marriage, is that my understanding in a wedding is that the people who come are not just an audience, they're participants. A wedding is a covenant made before witnesses. The witnesses are part of the ceremony. When I'm doing a wedding, I'll say, you're not just an audience. You're here as witnesses, like legal witnesses in court. You're not all going to sign the marriage certificate, but you're witnesses to hold them accountable to the vows they made to fulfill God's design in marriage. And even unbelievers are still married in the eyes of God because they're entering into His covenant of marriage. And so I can't be a witness to that. I can't affirm that choice, even though this may create alienation. And I have a friend whose daughter is in her 30s, and she's decided she's a man, and he and his wife want a relationship with their daughter, but her conditions are, you must affirm the choice I've made, you must use the pronouns I insist you use. And so 1 Samuel 2:29, actually the classic failed parent is Eli, and in 1 Samuel 2:29 it says he honored his sons above God. That was what the prophet said, that our first priority has to be honoring God. And sometimes we can't be at peace with someone the way we would like if it comes at the expense of honoring God and His Word. And so that's where we're feeling the pressure now. When Jesus said in Luke 12, there would be in the same family 5 people, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. That's what the gospel divides families sometimes. When He says you must hate father and mother if you're going to follow me, what He's really meaning is that if you have to choose between your parents and Him, you choose Him. And some of us are going to be living with conflict we don't want. And, I think, like, as far as I'm concerned, I've not had to deal with this specific problem, but, I wouldn't go to the wedding, but I'd have them over for dinner sometime. But, the Bible doesn't forbid me from having meals with people who are immoral if they're not believers. And I can be loving and friendly, but I can't capitulate on their worldview to have peace. And so, anyway, that kind of related to last night. Now that you have the cool folder that it kind of serves as a review, but the 4 G's of peacemaking. As I said, Ken Sande loves alliteration, and so he has these 4 G's, and we worked on the first 2 last night. I didn't emphasize the first one quite as much as I would have liked, but 2 Corinthians 5:9, our aim, whether alive or dead, whether absent from the body or present with the body, is to be pleasing to Him. And so as conflict comes, and this is an adjustment in thinking. I mean, normally in conflict in the flesh, if conflict comes, the issue is, I want to win. I want to get my way. I'm right. They're wrong. And yet for the believer in conflict, the objective is, I want to honor God in this conflict, however it goes. I want to do that which pleases Him, which would be, some we did talk about, is to be humble, not to be contentious, to be willing to give on secondary issues, to show grace. I did something glorious this morning. She's out of the room now. So talked about it's a glory to overlook a matter. So in my mind, maybe she wasn't at fault. I thought she was, and I decided I will put into practice the excellent verse that we referenced last night. So don't tell her when you see her. By the way, she's heard this many times from me, and she has gone 4 years plus getting 10,000 steps a day without missing a day. So I told her, while I'm saying stuff she's already heard, she's free to walk around and get her 10,000 steps because we're going to the airport later. Anyway, so our aim is, I can't guarantee that I'll come out of this with the solution I want. I can't guarantee I'll come out of this with my kids liking me. But I can glorify God in how I deal with this. And that's my objective. And sometimes our loyalty to Christ is going to create division. Jesus said the world is going to hate you. And problems have occurred in the history of the church when people were more concerned about pleasing others and keeping the peace than they were defending the truth. So our first aim is to glorify God. Then last night we talked about get the log out of your own eye from Matthew 7. And you can see on the back of the folder, he has the 7 A's of confession we went over last night. And by the way, let me tell you why I like this folder so much. I keep a few of these stuck in my Bible. And most weeks I end up having to replenish them. I use them so much in counseling, and especially if you're familiar with the material, and after hearing me talk about it for a few hours, you should be doing pretty well. If you've read the Peacemaker book, there's a shorter version called Resolving Everyday Conflict, which is kind of peacemaking for dummies or something. It's about a third as long, covers the main points. These are things you can use and share with others and to help you remember these things. We went through that last night, that in a relationship, if the garden or the field is covered with weeds and thorn bushes, the process is you want to pull the weeds. You want to spread on the gospel roundup. And so Jesus said, first get the log out of your own eye, and that is to identify where is my sin, where is my fault, and then not just to say I'm sorry, because the words I'm sorry don't say enough, really. And that's where, especially when there's been significant sin and conflict, to acknowledge that this is specifically what I did wrong. I've tried to understand how this has hurt you. Here is what's going to change as a result. And will you forgive me? It's a model of what we're doing with the gospel. We ask God, we don't just say to God, I'm sorry. We're saying, I've sinned, will you forgive me? And so that same kind of gracious transaction is taking place among husbands and wives, parents and children, friends, board members in a church. That's just in all close relationships, this is going to be happening. If you haven't sought somebody's forgiveness this week, you're probably not aware enough of your sin. And of course, we also said it begins with seeking forgiveness from God. Question would come up after last night. It would be, well, what if I seek forgiveness and this other person won't forgive me? And Proverbs chapter 18:19 says, a brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city. Some of that's going to be on them when we get to forgiveness, but also from your standpoint, perhaps you did not identify all of the weeds, or perhaps you did not pull them all the way out by the roots. And so it may be there was something lacking in your effort at seeking forgiveness. I mentioned last night that a good thing to do if there's been a sharp conflict would be, here's where I know I was wrong, but there may be other things, specific events where I've hurt you or patterns that have hurt you that I'm not as sensitive to, and so I want you to tell me because I want things to be right between us. Sometimes, when there's been something major, like I gave the example last night of unfaithfulness, sometimes the offended party just needs some time to process this, and it's not necessarily a refusal to forgive, but this is a big change if you're seeking forgiveness, and sometimes they want to see, well, you're saying the right thing. You can pull out the little thing and go through it and say the right words, but do I see evidence that your heart has really changed? And I think, if we're the ones seeking forgiveness, especially if it's something significant, we ought to be patient. And then I'll talk later about, I've mentioned last night, getting help and keep trying. Pursue peace, Hebrews 12. Keep pursuing it. I think of, it's a silly example, but I've seen like in movies where you have the rabbit and the dogs chasing the rabbit, the mechanical rabbit in the race or something. Like you just keep chasing it. Hopefully you'll catch it. That's up to the Lord ultimately. And then the next major category in here of the kind of 4 G's is gently restore. And for people who are conflict avoiders, this is some of the hardest material because we would prefer to hold it inside when we've been hurt by somebody, or we'd prefer to tell other people what the bad thing is that somebody did to us. Most of us don't enjoy conflict. I think that I'm less conflict averse than the average person, but even as someone who's less conflict averse, I still don't like it. But the Bible teaches that love sometimes requires you to go and show your brother his sin. Leviticus 19:18 is a famous verse. You know what it is? It's quoted in the New Testament. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But the previous verse isn't quoted so often. It says in Leviticus 19:17, you must not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You must surely reprove your neighbor. And so if you see someone doing wrong, it's hateful not to correct them. It's the duty of a brother or sister. The verse that kind of launched the modern biblical counseling movement is Romans 15:14. Concerning you, I'm convinced you're full of goodness and knowledge, able to admonish each other, counsel, exhort. But there's sometimes we have a responsibility before God for confrontation. We already did in Matthew 7:5. Jesus said, after you get the log out of your own eye, then you can see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. And this is something that all of us are responsible for. This isn't like, well, I'll just leave it to the elders, and if somebody's in sin, then just trust they'll figure it out and find it someday. It's a responsibility of every believer. And a passage that I so love is in Galatians 6:1. I'm going to camp there for quite a bit this morning in this talk, but there is just an immense amount of wisdom wrapped up in this one verse. And I want to give you some of the context, actually, because the context of this verse is very important. In the book of Galatians, if you haven't studied it, Paul follows his kind of typical pattern where he, in the first part of the book, is explaining the gospel. And in this case, he's defending the gospel against those who would add works and try to put people back to Judaism. And he spends a long time doing that. But also, as is typical in Paul's epistles, he then comes to some application. And that's in chapter 5, verse 13. So it's with just a chapter and a half to go. You were called to freedom, brethren, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so the part of what he's getting at is we're saved by grace alone, but as those who have received all this grace, don't take the freedom of God's forgiveness as an excuse to be lawless and to be unloving. That the right way, that we're not saved by loving one another, but those who are saved will love each other, and that's really important. And then verse 15 is a verse that often comes to my mind when I'm counseling people. I don't always quote it to them, but it's what I think I see. But if you bite and devour one another, take care you're not consumed by one another. And that's what sometimes happens. That's what we're trying to resolve in biblical peacemaking. And then in chapter 5, 16th, at the end of chapter 5, he goes through really what we know so well as the fruit of the Spirit. It says, if we walk by the Spirit, we will not carry out the desires of the flesh. The Spirit and the flesh are at war against each other. And then he goes to the deeds of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. And then the chapter division, I think, is not ideal. The chapter divisions are not inspired by God. This is just what people did, and it's convenient. But chapter 6, verse 1, I think really fits into this, which is in the context of loving one another, but also dealing with temptations to bite and devour one another. Brethren, chapter 6, verse 1, if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself so that you will not be tempted. And so this is a duty we have to one another. When you see someone caught in a sin, and we're not free to avoid. And this is actually something, the way I process it, back to the kind of the prime directive of glorifying God, is that I see a situation and I realize in my conscience, even though I don't want to do this, it's my responsibility before God to go to this person. And I see something that's wrong. I see sin. I may see other people affected by it. It could be in our relationship, but sometimes it just has nothing directly to do with me other than I see what's happening. And I realize, concrete example, you have two single guys who are roommates, and one of them sees the other one drinking excessively, and it's kind of stupid when he's had too much to drink. Or you have two roommates, and one of them sees the other one looking at something on the screen they shouldn't be looking at. And it doesn't directly affect you necessarily, but out of love, you need to be concerned for their soul. And so you have this responsibility. Now, there's a word that Ken Sandy uses called passport, and almost like passport and visa. But I was in Greece not long ago, Indonesia, different places. I was Dominican Republic a week ago, and you can't get in without a passport. That's your entry. And then talks about passport in relationships, that if you're going to correct someone, how do you get passport? Well, they know you love them. They know that you care about them. You're going to be exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit, as we're going to see. One thing about Caroline, for example, Caroline by nature is a conflict avoider. And I even remember 25, we've been married 40, how long? 44 years. 44 and a half years. And I remember many years in thinking she just virtually never corrects me because she's a conflict. I even thought that's kind of dangerous. And then she got trained in biblical counseling, and she's been making up for lost time ever since. But when I see her coming, and I can tell, here it comes. Sometimes there's certain things I do that she frequently corrects me. I think in terms of, I know she's doing this to help me be a better man. She's not doing this to vent her frustration at me. She's often doing it out of concern for my testimony before the Lord and other people, not so often even how it affects her personally. So passport is when you trust somebody that they care about you. And that's ideal. Now, if you don't have a lot of passport, you sometimes still have to go. Another aspect would be that be very careful if you don't have proof concerning their sin. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7, love hopes all things, believes all things, endures all things. Love tries to assume the best. And we need to be very careful. You could think of the famous example in 1 Samuel 1, where Hannah is praying, and Levi makes an assumption. Here's this woman, in the days of the judges, probably a lot of drunk women around, but she was praying to God. But he's accusing her of being drunk. Well, he did not have that information, so we have to be very careful. I'll give you a couple of concrete examples where there could be a misunderstanding, where the husband is there working on his laptop and the wife walks in and he slams the screen down. Well, she could be concerned that he's looking at something that a husband shouldn't look at. or he could be buying her anniversary gift for the 45th anniversary, which is in September. And another example, and this has actually happened sometimes, where I express, for example, I follow something close to the Billy Graham rule. I will not meet alone with a woman in a restaurant or different things, just being careful. And there's a situation where you could have walked by a restaurant and seen me sitting at the table with another woman and no one else there. Well, you could go start spreading a rumor that I'm having an affair. And it's okay, by the way, if you ask me. I say, hey, I saw you sitting in the restaurant. Help me understand what's going on. That's fair enough. Or I saw you slam down your laptop. Is everything okay? Well, the situation was, I'm in a restaurant, Carolyn and I with another couple. The husband of couple A and the wife of couple B go to the restroom. So for 5 minutes, I'm alone at the table with the wife. I'm not violating my standards, but it could have the appearance of that. And so we need to be careful. I would also say there are certain things that are harder to prove than others. You can take what people actually say and do, and you can confront that. Pride, for example, is something you can smell, but unless you have statements or actions, it can be very hard to prove that. So we have to be very careful. And again, part of it is making assumptions. So there's a high standard of proof. And then even be careful about judging motives, love hoping all things. 1 Corinthians 2:11, who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? You could be tempted to say, well, you did that just to annoy me. Well, maybe not. I tend to, and I probably will do this to some of you before I'm done, my mind is working. Maybe I'm on the spectrum somewhere, I don't know, but, and I get focused. And there was a time in church when we had an older lady who's actually probably close to my present age. And I walked right past her, and I'm just thinking about my sermon or some problem, and I just zoom right past her. And she grabs me and say, how dare you walk past me without greeting me? I never did it again. But, her temptation, and they think, he's mad at me, he's snubbing me. And so love hoping all things. You'd really try to assume the best. Doesn't mean you can't ask questions, but be very careful. Again, there's nothing wrong. Say, help me understand why you said this. Are you upset with me? And try to hope the best. And then another question would be, last night I said love covers a multitude of sins. It's a glory to overlook a matter. It's wise to be slow to anger. How do you determine which sins you confront and which you let go? And Scripture gives us guidelines in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, which talks about church discipline. Paul says in chapter 5, verse 1, there's actually reported there is immorality among you, immorality that does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. And then further down in verse 11, he said, I wrote you not to associate with any so-called brother if he's an immoral person, covetous, idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. And so there are degrees of heinousness of sin. And we all sin quite a bit, if we're honest. If we could see, I know I sin quite a bit, and I know I don't even see the half of it. The Lord sees my own selfishness, pride, all these things that are going on in my own heart, sinful anger. But there are sins that are at a level, and he's giving drunkenness, obviously idolatry, swindling people, cheating people, sexual immorality, that 1 Corinthians 5 says that a little leaven leavens the whole lump, and especially in the community of the church, that if people are engaging in certain sins, where a common example would be a couple comes to your church, they claim to be Christians, but they haven't been married, but they're living together, and that's something you need to be dealt with because you don't want that to become part of the culture of your church because that would dishonor God. And so there's some situations where there is sin so serious. Another example would be we've had a couple cases where a husband would have a drink container like this or a Yeti or something, and he's pretending to drink 7-Up, and his wife knows that it's half full of vodka, Diet Coke. And so again, this is concern for him, and she can tell he's being affected by what he's drinking, which also can relate to a second aspect, which would be sins which would cause harm to the offender. That at the end of James's epistle, in verse 19 of chapter 5, my brethren, if any of you strays from the truth and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. And so sometimes we're on a rescue mission, and I have had cases where a roommate sees their other roommate looking at things they shouldn't look at, or turning to some kind of substance abuse, and for the sake of their own soul, you're on a rescue mission to try to help them to be free of that sin, because it can harm them spiritually. Sometimes confronting over a sin that could harm other people, quote the golden rule, where this person is abusing, and so there's harm to other people that I have to confront this person for that reason, for the sake of the victims. And then there's kind of one more category, which is sometimes there's an issue that just could affect your relationship with this person. And I'll make a bit of a confession. I won't go anyway. Where there's sometimes when Caroline does things that annoy me, believe it or not, and I will tell myself, if I were a more godly man, I would overlook this. But it just really, really bugs me. And I've had times where I have to go say, look, I probably should overlook this. If I were more godly, maybe I would. But this thing you said or did hurt me. And if you'll ask for forgiveness, I will forgive you. And when you're in a strong relationship, that can happen. And that can be a valid thing, that this is affecting me. It's affecting our relationship. I've tried to deal with it. So let's talk about it. Again, not just marriage. That's parents and children, church members together, rather than letting the weed continue to grow until it takes over the relationship. Ephesians 4, I guess we'll talk about anger later, but don't let the sun go down in your anger, lest you give the devil an opportunity. Another aspect of this is the general rule that you go directly to the person before you involve other people. This is the same principle you see in Matthew 18, where Jesus says in verse 15, that if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. And so, again, what's the temptation? We find it easier to tell third parties about the sins of other people than actually going straight to that other person. It's called gossip. And we want sympathy, whatever. We want vindication. Maybe we even want revenge. And so the general principle would be that if I see their sin before I bring anybody else in, I'm going to go to them between the two of us, and then I'm going to just add some practical advice. And that would be, I think, to go as personally as possible. Some of you know of Ted Tripp. He's a Reformed Baptist pastor, wrote Shepherding a Child's Heart. And he had said that among their elders, when he was in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, that there was an agreement that if there was going to be a confrontation, which, by the way, happens among leaders of churches where we disagree about something or we think somebody's done something wrong, that if that's going to happen, it cannot be by a text or an email. It needs to be face-to-face. I think that's also a wise thing with reference to friendship, marriage, etc., right? There are many advantages to a face-to-face discussion. One thing is that if you're really upset about something, in the privacy of your own room, when you're typing out how upset you are, you might say something in the flesh that you would have never said to them personally. And so you can just make things worse. There's also the fact that when you're face-to-face, there's opportunity for clarification right away, that they won't assume you meant something else. There's an opportunity to express love, to make eye contact, to make connection, to reassure. And so general rule, if you're in different countries or something, Zoom. The more personal, the better. and then to be cautious about involving people unnecessarily. A couple of applications this would have. One time, I was in a situation where I heard someone complain about the sin of a third person. And I loved the response of the man who heard it and said, "And what did he say when you talked to him about that?" And so I think we need to be careful. It can be not only sinful to gossip, it can be sinful to hear gossip. When you hear, "I saw Jim in a restaurant with a woman that wasn't Caroline, some blonde, and what's going on?" Well, that can cause more problems. Again, that's in the realm of gossip. Now, there are exceptions to this. Paul did not go through multiple stages in from Matthew 18 when he confronted Peter in Galatians 2. And even Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, when you had the man who was sexually immoral, within the family. And I think the principle is sometimes there are public sins that can be dealt with publicly without necessarily having to go through that process. So that's the norm. Well, so you have these general principles, but then there are many examples of this in the Bible where we'll talk about forgiveness, that there can be times when there are consequences. We would think that's a bit exceptional. So there could be times when something needs to be dealt with publicly because it was public. I would think that would be normally something church leaders would handle and not the rest of us necessarily. Another example of where others might need to be involved is, again, thinking of a specific case where we had a situation where we were concerned abuse was taking place, and the wife found strong, almost irrefutable evidence that her husband, who was borderline abusive, had been committing sexual immorality with other people. And she knew she needed to confront him, but she sought advice of elders. What do I do now? And we thought that somebody else needed to be there to keep her safe in that situation. So that's another example where actually myself and there's another guy bigger than I am, and we went with her to her husband and then basically helped her kick him out, with the evidence that she had, but it might have been unsafe for her in that situation. So general rule, you go as personally as possible. There can be some exceptional situations. But then how you do it is also really important. And I'm actually going to jump in the folder to something that's not mainly in your notes, but on the back he has something called the pause principle, and it's for negotiating. So he's using this very broadly, and we're not going to cover every aspect of biblical peacemaking in 4 hours, believe it or not. There's some situations where there's a disagreement, where there's mediation required, and actually it's an exception worth mentioning now. There's a difference between a situation in our church where, for example, another case that happened where a divorced woman confessed to her friend, shared with her friend that she was having an affair with a married man. And that's clearly sin. And so when this woman would not listen to her friend, then she brought in some of the elders and we had to deal with it. So that's the kind of situation Jesus is envisioning in Matthew 18. Your brother sinned. It's clear. You go to him or to your sister. Same with Galatians 6. Someone is caught in a trespass or a sin, and then you go to them. There are other situations where there's a disagreement and both are pointing at the other, and that's a little more complicated. That's a situation where, let's say that Sam agrees to remodel Dave's bathroom, and they've agreed on a price. And Dave is not satisfied with Sam's work and won't pay him. And Sam says he fulfilled the requirements, and Dave wanted things that weren't in the original contract, and da-da-da. And they both would say the other person needs to be confronted. Well, that's sometimes where mediation will come in, which is, the example of mediation I can think of in the Bible, as I mentioned last night in Philippians 4, where these two women in the church were having conflict they couldn't resolve. And it wasn't, this one is in sin, this one is not. They're just having this conflict, and there's, in the Greek, this Paul calls upon this other person in the church to help these women come to an agreement. Mediation is also something that are any lawyers here? So that's indicative, isn't it? I guess. I don't know. I was almost a lawyer. But mediation typically is where someone tries to help the two parties to agree but can't force either one of them to do anything. You try to get them to talk to each other and reach a conclusion. Another situation can be what they would call legally binding arbitration. That's what actually Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 6. But again, these are different scenarios than just this one person sinned and this one didn't. And so whenever Sam and Dave can't agree, and maybe nobody can get them to agree, Paul then in 1 Corinthians 6 describes a scenario in verse 1. Does any one of you dare, when he has a case against his brother, go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? And verse 6, brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers. That's a defeat for you. And his point is going to be, it'd be better to get godly people in the church, godly men in the church to arbitrate would be the word that would be the legal word now, meaning both parties agree that we are going to express our case to, these two elders or one elder from each of our churches or something, and whatever they decide, we agree in advance we will go with. We're giving up our right to settlement. Better that than going to the courts before unbelievers. And so there are different scenarios in peacemaking. The 90%, that was my diversion into other situations. And actually, the Ken Sandy and the Peacemaker Ministries actually developed entire courses in how to do mediation and how to do arbitration. I took some of those courses, and they were very interesting. Back to the mainstream, so that we're dealing now with conflict between people and where there's sin on one side or both sides that needs to be confessed. But the pause principle of negotiating that he has here applies not only in arbitration and mediation, but I think it also, where I think of it applying is when you're going to confront somebody, these are considerations. The first, and by the way, this is another thing, he also likes where it spells out, so P-A-U-S-E, and then, okay, I know that I need to confront my friend because I've seen him mistreating his wife in public. Okay, what do? Well, I prepare. How do I prepare? I pray. I pray for the right time and the right opportunity. I'm thankful to God how many times, once I realize God expects me to confront this person based on Scripture, and I start praying for the right time and opportunity to do it so it wouldn't be this kind of stark thing, how the opportunity often comes pretty soon. Another way to prepare is thinking, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it? Which is more what Galatians 6 does. Affirming relationships. Again, just, I care about you. I love you. That's what Paul does in Philippians 4, how these two women served alongside of me for the gospel. And so, again, there's a whole book, Practicing Affirmation by Sam Crabtree, which I think has really been a blessing to me, where he shows that it's biblical to affirm God's good work in other people. And so to acknowledge that, our relationship is important to me, and then also maybe to God, these are the things I see that God has done in your life. It's not just setting them up by making something up. It's something you would want to say sincerely. I'll give you an example from my own life. Speaking of lawyers, actually, that I had a lawyer friend who did financial tax stuff for his practice, and we went on a retreat together, and he said, if you ever have any questions, email me and I'll answer your questions. And every now and then, pastor's tax stuff is complicated. I would email him a question, and he would send back a short answer. And then one time I sent him an email with a question, and I got back from one of his underlings this 7-page legalese thing I couldn't understand, and a bill for several $100s. And so, what do I do? Well, okay, first of all, our relationship is more important to me than $700. Now, I also made a counteroffer. And I never again asked him a question, and that maybe that's what he wanted, but that did resolve it. But just our relationship, this is how important a relationship is. Understand interests, that try to see it from their perspective, try to see their side, how hard this is for them. Philippians 2, consider others more important than yourselves. Even in the midst of a conflict. Here's where I've been using this in marriage conflict, is that thinking of one particular couple where he was a pastor, his wife accused him of being abusive. I think that on a scale of 1 to 10, he would have been a 2 at worst. I mean, he would sometimes be selfish or speak out unkindly. He never threatened, hurt, But she was all super sensitive on the issue. And they've been living in misery since he resigned as a pastor. Well, they were living in misery before he finally resigned because of her. She was talking to other people and everything else. And now their church leadership council has asked Carol and me to try to mediate with them. And one thing I've tried to say to both of them is that even if you think the other person is primarily wrong here, realize they're hurting. Ephesians 4:32 says, be tenderhearted. That even if some of what has happened is her own fault, she's still as miserable as she could be, and you should have compassion. God has compassion on us when our sin makes us miserable. Jesus had compassion on the crowds. The father of the prodigal son had compassion on his son. Isaiah 55, God has compassion on us when we've sinned and are repentant. And so to understand from their side how hard this is and not just think about yourself. And then, searching for creative solutions, evaluating options. This is more for Sam and Dave about the bathroom or something, but the example in Daniel, where Daniel didn't want to eat the food and his friends and found a solution that would satisfy the guard. And you're looking for not just I want to get my way, but you're looking for something that would satisfy the concern of the other person. So that's a kind of a short summary, but as you realize you have to confront somebody, thinking about pausing is even a good way. Slow to anger, slow to speak. And so how you do it, and I'm going to go back to Galatians 6:1 and cover it as best I can in 13 minutes. That just going through the language here, if anyone is caught in any trespass, against whom is a trespass? It's against God. And that's really important. Again, I'll think of the example last night where the husband had been unfaithful. For the wife to realize that his unfaithfulness is much more of an indication of his broken relationship with God than his broken relationship with you. No matter how many challenges you might have had in a marriage, if he was walking with God, this would have not happened. And so to get the focus off of yourself, then to, if this person was cruel to you or unkind to you, it's more a sin against God. Get yourself out of the picture as much as you can. And then the main verb is restore. You're there to fix it. You're not there to punish or to judge. And the word restore is used elsewhere. And it's a fairly unusual word, but it's used elsewhere of fishermen mending nets. And the idea is if you're a fisherman and your net has a big hole in it, your family's going to starve. The net is useless unless you fix it. You might use it like setting a broken bone. And so you're there, and my analogy has been you're coming as a nurse, not a lawyer, not a judge, not a prosecutor. And what so often happens in relationships, people who are conflict avoiders will avoid and avoid and avoid and avoid, and then finally they confront. But why are they confronting then? Well, they've held it all in, and then it comes out, not for the purpose of restoration, but for the purpose of venting. And I've had it now, and this is so much in the movies and talk shows where, finally I'm going to tell you what I think of you and put you in your place. That is not restoration, that's revenge. Don't take revenge. You're here to help. You're here to fix something, not to smash it into smithereens. Again, I'm a nurse. And again, that's where I give Caroline, she's the best at this of anybody I've ever known. And she is with me, with our counselees, with our kids, that I really know when she comes to me, she's on my side trying to help me be a more godly man. And then, who can go? It says, you who are spiritual. Well, I've given you the hint. I think this is all of a piece from the middle of Galatians 5 here. Spiritual doesn't just mean, oh, this person is so spiritual. They just kind of walk around. No, spiritual goes back to the fruit of the Spirit. If you walk by the Spirit, you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. And so, how do you know if you're ready to go? Well, is your heart characterized by the fruit of the Spirit? You go in love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. A lot of confrontation is not any of those things, right? Much of it is fleshly. And actually, my understanding of the deeds of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit in the context is a primary reference is how we treat each other. And the majority of the deeds of the flesh are envy and strife and outbursts of anger. And the fruit of the Spirit is often, it's directed to how we treat each other. It's going back to, love is the fulfillment of the law. Don't bite and devour each other. Instead, walk in the Spirit. And then you're walking in the Spirit. You're caring for people. So if you're angry and you want to vent on somebody, by all means, do not confront them. You're just going to make it worse. And that's where, I know that timeouts aren't by Christians the popular child training technique, but I think there is a sense in which, like a couple, might need to give themselves a timeout in terms of if you can't go spiritually, then don't go. Now, that doesn't mean go play video games or look at your phone, but it does mean I need to get right with God so that I can do this very hard thing in a way that I'm walking in the Spirit, if that makes sense. If I'm not walking in the Spirit, just self-examination, go through the fruit of the Spirit. Is this what's coming in and out of me? Or do I want revenge? Do I want to let him have it? Well, if you want to let him have it, keep your mouth shut. You're just going to make things worse. By the way, Galatians 5:17, this is hard. For the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. These are in opposition to one another, that you may not do the things that you please. It's difficult. It specifically says that it should be in a spirit of gentleness. That's significant as well, in that one thing just remember is, do you enjoy being confronted even if you're guilty? Do you enjoy having someone, if you had a splinter in your eye, who would you want to do it? Would you want some angry person with, rusty scissors to yank it out? Or would you want a highly trained nurse with sterilized tweezers to take it out? But I think that when we confront people, it's hard to be confronted, even if you're wrong. So you want to go as gently, lovingly, kindly as you can. And again, the easy way for me is just remember how I feel when I get confronted. And he even says, keep looking to yourself so that you will not be tempted. And he doesn't specify the temptation. I think probably the temptation is to be fleshly in the midst of the confrontation. And sometimes it takes patience. And then back to Matthew 18, if your brother repents, you forgive him, the relationship is restored, and you can rejoice. You've won your brother. And this should be common in all close relationships. I have been with couples that have never really had confession of sin, loving confrontation and restoration over many years of marriage. They just kept, sweeping the weed seeds into just let the weeds grow and never really resolved things. And the field becomes overgrown. A couple key aspects of this. One would be, does the wife have a right to confront her husband? I think I've already indicated what I think the answer is. Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, you go to him, unless he's your husband or your pastor or your father, in which case you just let it go. That's not what he says, is it? And I think it should be done respectfully, but I think actually a problem with people of authority is they often refuse to be corrected. And that's one thing they need to be corrected for. That you should be able to go respectfully to a church leader, a wife should be able to go respectfully to a husband, a child should be free to go to parents and express respectfully concerns. That's the most loving thing to do. And that's something, and I have had, the reason I'm bringing this up, I've had situations where a husband who is borderline abusive, porn, drunkenness, laziness, more or less say to his wife, you don't dare tell anybody else what I'm doing. I have authority over you, I command you not to. And respectfully, I would say we must obey God rather than men, and that it's actually for his good, that none of us is safe if no one can confront us over our sin. Which brings me to the next point, and it's another one of my favorite verses, and that is that how well do you receive correction? That honest, again, you don't need to show of hands or anything, but you think about when have somebody tried to correct you recently, or if you imagine somebody coming to you. There's a verse that I quote to myself when I see, as I already said, I can see Caroline coming sometimes. First of all, I have a little sense I did one of those things that she doesn't like for me to do, and I can kind of, in her own sweet way, I can just see it coming. And my immediate temptation is to defend and counterattack. That you've told me not to do that, but you did it just yesterday. And I am perfectly justified in the thing that I did. And that is an unwise response. So my verse is Proverbs 9:8. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. And so I tell myself, it is, by the way, Caroline's not the only person who ever corrects me. There are other people too. And when I see this coming, it doesn't even mean I'm going to have to agree with the person. But one thing I realize is probably for a conflict avoider like Caroline to confront me is really hard. And I don't want to push her away by saying, you're going to be consequences if you do that, and she'd be tempted to quit. I want to make her feel safe and free to be able to come to me with her concerns, and likewise even other people. Okay, I'm a seminary professor, I'm a pastor, and I realize for someone else who's a student or a friend at church or whatever to come to me, I don't think of myself this way normally. I have to kind of force myself to think, I'm just Jim. But I can see how from their standpoint, that would be really hard to confront me. And so I want to receive that where that would be a good experience for them. And again, that doesn't mean I have to agree even, but I need to carefully consider it, that I don't want to be the scoffer who defends and counterattacks. I want to be the wise person who embraces correction, evaluates it biblically, seeks clarification, willing to seek forgiveness. Just as we're wrapping up this part, I'm going to assume some things in terms of how you've been taught and how you practice, that this doesn't always work. And that's where the rest of Matthew 18 is, where if your brother will not listen to you, then you bring one or two others, and if he won't listen to you, it goes to the church. And so sometimes if you have a spouse who's getting drunk, or a friend who's immoral, or that there's serious sin, someone is cheating other people, within the church, God has given a wise structure, and it has at least two purposes. One purpose would be, and I've seen this happen, where the husband wouldn't listen to his wife, but when two elders came along with the wife, the husband all of a sudden, we got his attention. And I mean, it happened to me one time where this would be when we were living in Saudi Arabia. It would be when we were first moved, been like 5 years into our marriage. What year would that have been? 1994 by then. Anyway, And I was just giving Caroline the silent treatment. I mean, I would grunt or answer her stuff, but I wasn't drawing close. And she finally said to me, Jim, if you don't start working with me on these problems, I'm going to go call one of the elders over here, a certain person she named. And I decided I really didn't want that to happen. And just kind of snapped out of it, like, okay, I can't toy with this bitterness any longer. And we were able to deal with it. And so she was doing the right thing, even in her non-confronting days. And so, then the process of church discipline has, again, a twofold benefit. One would be you hope the person will be restored. And God uses church discipline. I think the example in 2 Corinthians 2 is where somebody had been put out is brought back in and shown love. And so God uses that. 1 Corinthians 5, you hand him over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh that he might repent. The other thing is that if someone, in the context of the church, is unrepentant, a little leaven leavens the whole lump, and they're not inside the church to cause further destruction. So again, this isn't a class on church discipline, but I mean, that's how things work. But back to the main point, I mean, Galatians 6:1 is worth memorizing. It's the instruction of how to restore your brother. And again, the operative word is, I'm here to help you. I'm here to restore you. I sense that something's not right, not broken. Because I love you, I want to help you. That should be happening in families, in churches, among friends. And it's the wisdom of the Word of God that He didn't just tell us to do it, He tells us how to do it. And as we walk in the Spirit and we strive to restore, we can see the Lord do good things.